the death toll is about the same as 9/11, probably. It's estimated about 3,000 people. The physical property destruction is actually greater. Than another American city has not had 28,000 buildings destroyed, nearly 5 square miles. I mean, the actual property destruction in this was as greater than any other disaster in a major American city. I mean, never before since has a major American city been this totally destroyed.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, looking at one unforgettable day and its three-day aftermath, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the book, The Longest Minute by Matthew Davenport. Mr. Davenport will soon join us on screen to discuss his book and show some historical images for 35 to 40 minutes. Then I will join him on screen to ask a few of my own questions and share yours. And now for some background on our speaker. Matthew J. Davenport is the author of First Over There, about America's first battle in World War I, the attack on Cantigny in France. This work was a finalist for the 2015 Guggenheim Lehrman Prize in Military History. The Pulitzer Prize-winning historian James McPherson heralded it as military history at its best. Mr. Davenport has been a contributing writer for the Wall Street Journal Book Review and Salon.com, and he is a member of the Author Guild. It is such a pleasure to have him here. Welcome to you, Mr. Davenport. I learned so much from reading your book. It is truly jaw-dropping. It's horrifying and uplifting all at once. There were some really brave individuals and families that helped that city to pull through. I could see that your experience of writing military history was useful in this account, and I can't wait to hear more about how you wrote it and also about the earthquake and the fire that I really didn't know that much about. And I understand from your book that that was quite deliberate in the early days. People didn't want to scare people away from San Francisco. So it's just a fascinating history. A note for our readers tonight, in the PowerPoint, you'll see some great archival resources listed in the upper left of a number of his PowerPoint slides. We won't be sharing that information in the chat, but we will include the links to those archives in our follow-up email. So there's lots to come. Let's get started. Over to you, Matt. Again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Margaret. This project started in 2012 when I visited San Francisco, and I noticed all throughout the city how much of the city is still shaped by this event. And I didn't know anything about it, and learned on that visit from various plaques and markers, and then in reading that 500 city blocks had been destroyed, that it was estimated about 3,000 people were killed, and that this at the time was the largest city in the Western United States, and it had been almost totally destroyed and by this event, which was, still called a natural disaster. And I said, how could that happen? And I wanted to know more. So I started to look at books on it. And the first book I read focused on the firefighting, but didn't answer my other questions of how all this happened. Another book I read then focused on the tectonic science of earthquakes, but didn't explain how that resulted in all these fires and all this destruction. And then the next book I read focused on the human stories, which are very interesting, but didn't tell how all this happened. And the question that ended up developing in my mind was, how does a natural disaster like this result in such unnatural devastation and destruction? And, is it the science of tectonics? Is it shortcomings in firefighting? Was it infrastructure failures? There are no surviving eyewitnesses. At that time, there were a few survivors, but they were too young to remember, and now there's none. And so all we have are archives. We have letters and diaries and journals and reports, And so I started digging through them and getting into the primary source materials and finding that, like so many other complicated issues, the answer is not in one place. The answer is multifaceted, because this was an intersectional event of geography, geology, city planning, political corruption, greed, discrimination based on both racism and socioeconomics, because certain demographic groups and classes had to live in unsafe conditions in certain places so that their fate was sealed before the ground moved. So the answers to the story went back to the development of San Francisco, that in its natural state, where the city formed, was this dry, windswept, hilly peninsula with few streams or natural reservoirs, not suitable at all as a population center. So, as everyone knows, the gold rush brought in an exploding population. The demand for the area as a provisioning supply port during the gold rush for speculators changed everything. Population exploded from fewer than 2,000 to 25,000 in 1 year. Soon it was 50,000, 100,000, and population outpaced city planning. And the city's real estate ended up expanding by moving all of this fill land and dirt and sand dunes out into the marshland of and waters of the shallow cove on the edge of the bay to make new real estate and make this unstable land that they could then build what was wooden and canvas structures, very temporary for transient laborers and workers and speculators. And there were very few regulations or building safety measures, or even very little law. It was very much a Wild West town. So what resulted, you'll see now, well, I want to start my slide presentation. In the first slide, you'll see what ended up resulting. Very early, the city was shaped by fire. And 6 separate fires in the short space of 2 years, 1849, 1850, 1851. Each one of them destroyed nearly the entire city, because it was wood shanty structures closely together. There was very little water supply. And then they would rebuild quickly, and another fire would come and rebuild quickly. And so there were warnings in these fires that people had to start heeding. The population had to start heeding that we need some volunteer firefighters. We later a paid fire department. We need emergency water cisterns, people to maintain buckets of water. But the larger warnings were ignored about fire safety measures, and likewise, not just the hazard of fire, but also was also the danger of earthquakes. As many people know, that peninsula then and today sits in between 2 faults, the San Andreas Fault and the Hayward Fault. They didn't know that then. The science of tectonics was not fully developed, but many earthquakes happened, and especially a major one in 1868, where after that, just like after the fires, in this case, architects and engineers made safety recommendations, urged changes to foundation standards and building codes, and these were heeded for more affluent residential areas and hotels that marketed to richer patrons, but not mandated citywide. And they weren't going to force poor tenements, landlords and owners of poor tenements, to heed these warnings. So what did you get? You had a city that was run largely by railroad money, because the Transcontinental Railroad then connected by the early 1870s. You had a population that was 150,000, 200,000. By 1905, had a population of more than 400,000. And it was run by developers, speculators. City government was run through bribes and favors that not only favored certain builders and landlords and to avoid inspections or get waivers from the few safety regulations that they had, but also maintain the monopolies of privately owned public services like electricity, gas, transportation, and most consequentially, water. The Spring Valley Water Company was privately owned, privately run. It maintained a monopoly through bribes of the state legislature and the Board of Supervisors, which was the governing city council of San Francisco and still is. And they would not require it to undergo the expense of improving the materials by 1904 and 5 of its 40-year-old cast iron water pipes that ran over soft ground, this made ground I discussed, or to install larger pipes in places where population had exploded. There were places where in working class tenements south of Market and in Chinatown, where Chinese Americans, the most discriminated against demographic, were forced to reside in very cramped, congested conditions. There were no safety standards there, and the water pipes that had been laid back in the 1870s and 80s now could not even supply a trickle out of the sinks in some of these boarding houses where on a single block 1,000 to 2,000 people lived, served by 4-inch and 6-inch water pipes, whereas the rich homes up on Nob Hill and Russian Hill were served by larger pipes with more water. This was very consequential. And the bribes of these, the owners of the Spring Valley Water Company kept city council, the board of supervisors, from forcing them to update their pipes, to build larger ones, or to install fire hydrants where they were needed. So the next slide you'll see, these are two men of consequence, very different. On the left, that's Mayor Eugene Schmitz. He was, for lack of a better term, bought and paid for. He was put up for mayor by a political boss named Abe Roof, and he and the board of supervisors were all elected of the same party, and they were very beholden to these financial interests and developers and the Spring Valley Water Company owners and investors. On the right, you see Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan, who was a career firefighter who did all he could to get the city government to listen to his warnings. He told them what would happen with the inadequate water supply, with the increasing population, the inadequate mains and brittle pipes and insufficient hydrants. They ignored him. The water cisterns that were supposed to be maintained by the city were not maintained. He kept warning them. He begged for funding for auxiliary water system. He begged for funding for a fireboat with drafting capabilities. He did what he could to improvise and overcome with his department and make it the most efficiently run department probably in the country, but it was against all the resistance of city government, and they could do very little about what this private water company was resistant, and the city government was resistant to making them do. So the next slide, you'll see this is the way the city looked in 1905 and 1906. It was fewer than 60 years after the gold rush, and the population was about 430,000. It was the largest city in the American West. It was the financial center of the Western United States. And it was very much a unstable minefield of collapsible death traps. More than 90% of the city's structures were either wooden or wood frame, which was a major fire hazard, and it was insufficient. There was insufficient water supply. The city had been warned with fires in the past. They had been warned with earthquakes in the past, and they were warned by scientists at Stanford and Cal and elsewhere that another big one was coming, and ignored that. So the next slide you see, this is the map of how the city looked. It's very similar to the way San Francisco looks today. Some of the districts and neighborhoods have changed. If I put this map in the book, it's a bit small, but this is the way the city looked. And at the bottom there, you'll see a link, and the USGS has developed a ground motion simulation video showing how the earthquake went through the city. At 5:12 a.m., April 18th, 1906, the big one that had been warned about struck. The San Andreas Fault, which sits about 2 miles off the west coast, off Ocean Beach, San Francisco, out in the Pacific, That's where the epicenter was. It fractured, and it with estimated moment magnitude of 7.9, which is still the strongest in the recorded history of California, and went for about 60 to 80 seconds. The fault fractured north and south, and shockwaves propagated from west to east through the city. And as it did so, in the next slide, you'll see it affected different structures differently. Now, here I'm showing a couple of structures that were affected, both of which sat on what I called soft alluvial soil. That's made ground. This is that ground that I told you they used to expand the city's real estate into marshlands and out into shallow waters. On the left there, that's a boarding house in the Mission District of Valencia Street Hotel. The bottom 3 floors literally just sank into the mud. Over on the right, you'll see a boarding house south of Market. Both of these were congested areas where working class people, mostly blue collar, lived. And you'll see the destruction to that boarding house, and much of it collapsed and walls fell. This happened throughout the city on soft ground, but on bedrock, there was very little movement. When earthquake shockwaves hit bedrock, like up on Nob Hill, Russian Hill, if you know the city of San Francisco, you know there are places that sit on bedrock, and that shakes this much. But if you're on in like in the Mission District or south of Market there, it's like shaking a bowl of gelatin. The bottom, down deep, 250 feet below the street surface in some places, is where bedrock is. And all this soft soil above shakes 3 and 4 and 5 times as much, like a bowl of gelatin. And that it loses its solidity, and the buildings that sit on it are exposed to much greater shaking than those that sit on bedrock. So throughout the city, it depended on where people lived as to how much the shock waves affected them and how they felt it. And you'll see the destruction there in those 2 places. But throughout the city on soft soil, the destruction was vast. On solid bedrock, like up in the richer and more affluent areas, there was nothing but maybe tipped broken chandeliers and some tipped lamps. In the next slide, you will see the first thing that happened after the earthquake was fire. For many years, there persisted, what I found out was largely a myth. It still persists today that the simple answer was, oh, gas lines broke, candles tipped, and fireplaces, chimneys broke, and fires started and spread that way. This is where research is important, and where my job as an attorney helped me to understand that there was litigation back then. There was litigation over with insurance companies. I'd read about it, and I said, well, if that much money was involved, where these business owners and these homeowners were suing insurance companies to collect on their damage to their the destroyed buildings and homes, then there were transcripts to these trials. And down in the National Archives in San Francisco, San Bruno, they have the transcripts of hundreds of eyewitnesses that testified under oath just months after this event about where these fires started and how. And every fire that spread into an unmanageable blaze, that the fires that spread throughout the city, about 50 of them, almost all of them started in unoccupied commercial spaces. And they started in places where iron foundries or laundries, where irons were kept over hot coals and the fires tipped out. These were unoccupied commercial spaces, and because of the lack of regulations, they went right into residential areas because they were poorly zoned. Also pharmacies, that they kept these volatile chemicals in glass jars on shelves, and they tipped and broke, and when they would mix with each other or be exposed to oxygen or especially heat, they would explode, either ignite or explode. And that started all these fires. On the left, you see a fire down near the waterfront that started in a factory and spread very quickly. On the right, you'll see a fire that started in a pharmacy that spread very quickly into the buildings and businesses right there on Market Street at Fremont. In that case, look at where the sun is. It's very low. This was before 7 a.m. Within just an hour, hour and a half, the fires were spreading to unmanageable levels. And what was happening with the water pipes? Well, they were this brittle old iron pipes. They had not been updated. They ran through soft soil, and most of them broke. Most of them spilled out into the soil. There were some reservoirs in the city where pipes were managed on bedrock areas to stay intact. And in those few areas, there were a few hydrants that still worked. But in most places, the fire department, I don't want to say helpless, because they would go and draw from cisterns and they would improvise, but they did all they could working against the odds that had been, set for them by this poorly managed city government. In the next slide, you will see a fire company on the left. Now, they use steam pump fire engines then. They're drawing from one of the intact fire hydrants west of Van Ness. If you know San Francisco, this is the Western residential area. And they have to pump from this hydrant. They had to pump to another engine to go up and reach to put a line on that church you see up there. On the right, I put a then and now photograph of Sacramento Street looking east. And these were taken on the same date in the year. The one at the top was the morning of the earthquake. And you'll see, looking straight ahead, this wall of smoke, and it's blocking out the sun. This was taken around between 6:30 and 7 a.m. So just within an hour and a half of the earthquake, that's how much the fires had spread. I put the picture at the bottom. I took that at 6:30 a.m. April 18th last year from the exact same place, and you'll see how low the sun is. And at the top, you'll see how much that wall of smoke is blocking out the sun and how quickly those fires spread. And the next slide, you'll see two men, again, very different. The military responded. The military had many posts there, naval and army posts. And on the left, there's Frederick Funston, who was the acting commander of the army garrison that was at the Presidio and Fort Mason and other army posts. He was actually the acting division commander for what was, in effect, the West Coast, the Pacific Division. On the right, you'll see a young lieutenant in the Navy, and he was stationed up at Mare Island, which is just northeast of San Francisco. And he commanded, or he skippered a destroyer. On the left, Frederick Funston decided when the earthquake and fires happened that he would order all of his troops, all of his soldiers into the city fully armed to prevent looting and protect property. It was unlawful. It was illegal. The only thing he could lawfully do was send them in to protect federal property, but he sent them in to protect property and sent them in under the civilian control of the mayor and the police and the fire department. And Mayor Schmidt sent them with shoot to kill orders out into neighborhoods to protect property, and orders to shoot to kill anyone that's suspected of looting. And you can imagine what neighborhoods they were sent to. They weren't sent to the poor neighborhoods south of Market or they're into Chinatown. They were sent into the affluent neighborhoods and fully armed. On the right there, you see Lieutenant Freeman, who was ordered by his admiral up at Fort Mason to send a medical crew into the city. And he looked at the city and said, Lieutenant Freeman did, and said, I can see that there's a big fire. I'm going to, on my own, on his own accord, he decided to add two tugboats, a fireboat and a yard tug, which he knew had very strong pumping capabilities from the bay, in to help the fire department. And he split up his crew on the destroyer and took this firefighting flotilla up to the city and arrived at the waterfront around mid-morning, around 10:30. So he took his sailors in to help. In the next slide, you'll see what they saw when they arrived. This picture on the left was taken around the time that Lieutenant Freeman and his men arrived. You'll see the entire city behind that's the ferry building in the foreground. It's still there today. That behind that waterfront there, behind the wharf and all those piers, the entire city is already ablaze and it's burning rapidly. And Frederick Freeman and his sailors go up to a pier. He finds a fire captain and says, where can you use my pumps? And they pull down these fire engines that did not have any water supply. And he pumped from the bay to the fire engines, and that whole waterfront right there, they set to saving it. The ferry building and the waterfront, which is very consequential because it was the way in and out of the city for the population at the time. There were no bridges, so that was the way in and out of the city. On the right, you'll see a picture illustrating visually the firestorm that developed. This fire was so severe by within just a couple of hours, by mid-morning. That's south of Market, and the temperatures were reaching 2,000, 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, nearing 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So hot that it created its own windstorm, that in these canyons of building down these streets, as it would, the hot air would rise and create a vacuum, and that would suck the fresh air in from the next block, that would then radiate more heat across not just alleys, but then wider and wider streets and avenues. So it would hit the auto ignition temperature of most wooden structures or the wood frames of brick structures, and they would ignite, and it would go block by block by block. In the next, so that's what you see that they were up against. Now, part of what I wanted to do in my research was dispel some myths. And a major myth that has persisted still to this day is this myth of the ham and egg fire, that the newspaper blamed a woman cooking on a stove with a broken chimney for what would become the most destructive fire of the day. And that's the Hayes Valley fire, which is in the just west of where City Hall sat then and sits today. And they blamed her without evidence. They blamed an anonymous woman for cooking breakfast on a house with a broken chimney for starting this fire. I looked into it, and I went through voter registration records, and I went through city directories. You'll see some links here to the Sanborn insurance maps. Those show exactly what was at each address back in 1905. They have them for many cities. They're fascinating to go through. And you'll also see a link for the city directories for San Francisco. Most libraries in major cities have those. I went through them and found out that there, on the houses there where that fire started on the left, that's the photo of the fire actually starting, there were 14 men and 5 women. And it actually started in a commercial space. A record at the time showed that. So it was not a woman, and it started in a commercial space, not a residence. On the right, you'll see that's the fire in Hayes Valley about an hour later, and that merged with the fires south of Market and the waterfront to go citywide. That rumor, that myth has persisted, just like Miss O'Leary's cow with the Chicago fire, and it was very nice to be able to dispel it as untrue. The next slide, as I talk more about research, the importance of going back to source records, that many people that would be interviewed in their 60s and 70s and 80s would not purposefully, but they would be giving memories of memories or things they had read since. Going back and finding letters, that letter on the left is actually dated April 18th. There on the right, you'll see a diary. That's the entry for April 18th. People writing in the middle of the event, their present sense impressions. These were very important to go back to see who knew what when. So I could piece together the events as they went through what was 75 hours of fire. And on the right there, you'll see a birth certificate, and that was the only way that Chinese Americans, and I go into this deeply in the book, that lived in Chinatown, they would risk their life and limb to go back and retrieve their birth certificates because they would be deported if they didn't have them. I tell the story of someone, this is his original birth certificate, who actually they actually got bayoneted by a soldier who was looting in Chinatown to go back and get his own birth certificate while fires approached. Those are important archives right there. There's a lot of digital resources, but if you can go and visit these archives, the Chinese Historical Society of America, California Historical Society, San Francisco Public Library, 6th floor, has a great city history section, and they maintain great records there that have not been digitized, and you can go there and see this for yourself. In the next slide, you'll see this is an illustration of how vast that fire was. This is from looking down the peninsula down near way south San Francisco, looking up the peninsula. If you know the area, you know just how large that fire is. That's the first afternoon. It spread throughout the city and destroyed 500 city blocks. And on the right, that's a photo of the last fires on the third day. And you can see just how much they had scorched and burned through the city. And the next slide, after this, you will see a good visual illustration of how vast the destruction was. The first one on the left is looking up Nob Hill. That's the Fairmont and the James Flood Mansion, both of which are still there today. But you'll see everything was destroyed. Everything, every building was gutted. It was an ash heap of ruins. And on the right, this is the way things looked the day after the fire was put out. Still smoke rising, still ash everywhere. That's looking straight down or up Market Street. And the next slide, I did a then and now of these two locations, both on O'Farrell Street, looking toward what was then the Call Building, the tallest building in the city. Now it is Central Tower and does not look the same, but it was gutted and then rebuilt and refurbished. But you'll see the destruction and you'll see how the city looks today. And when you compare and contrast, we have not experienced a major American city reaching this level of destruction. Not before this, and not since. We've had flooding, but to have a city this totally destroyed was unprecedented. In the next slide, you'll see highlighted there is where that red mark, that's a map of San Francisco as it was in 1906. And you'll see that red boundary. Everything within that red boundary was destroyed. A couple things about this. One, most of the city existed within that burn district then. Most of the businesses, almost all of the banks, in fact, all 50 of the banks sat within that burn district. That burn district centered in the financial district, the commercial district, the Nob Hill, Russian Hill, over North Beach, Telegraph Hill, and all south of Market. What you will also see, though, is that the waterfront was saved, and all the way up around to the north end, what is now Fisherman's Wharf, all that was saved. And that was saved because of Lieutenant Freeman and his sailors, who brought these very powerful pumps on these two tugboats and their destroyer to help the fire department save the waterfront. On the west, you'll see it didn't go past Van Ness Avenue except in a couple of places into the residential areas west. And that's because the Army, after finally being released from what were very restrictive rules by Mayor Schmitz and the city to not allow fire breaks in certain property, they blew fire breaks with dynamite. The engineers, the Corps of Engineers that were stationed at the Presidio knew how to use dynamite. And they blew fire breaks along there, and it actually worked. There's a myth that persisted that all these fire breaks didn't work and started new fires. That was true the first couple of days, and I get into that in the book because they used black powder, which just started new fires. But the Army soldiers, one of the good things that they were able to do was blow fire breaks and save the residential areas to the west. What also saved the residential areas to the west and the south there, down in the Mission District, were two working hydrants. One that was still connected to a reservoir. I could follow the path. I went through Old Spring Valley Water Company schematic records to trace exactly which pipes survived. Out of more than 4,000 hydrants in the city, fewer than 50 were found to work throughout the disaster. And at the end, only a handful did. And those two were most important because those neighborhoods to the west there, not just Hayes Valley, but Cow Hollow, Pacific Heights, now all saved. And down the Mission District, it was stopped at 20th and Church by what is known as the Little Giant, the famous Little Giant that hydrant that kept pressure throughout because it had one working transmission main from the south. All the rest had broken and spilled out, and the hydrants didn't work. And that's why it took fire breaks and the Navy to save the west and the east of the city. On the next slide, you'll see the human toll here. More than 3,000 people were killed but more than 225,000, maybe a quarter million, were made homeless. They were unhoused, some of them for a year or two. And that affordable housing south of Market, which were poor, weak tenements, went away with the disaster. Many of them never returned to the city. You'll see this tent city at Fort Mason, and there were similar ones at Presidio and Golden Gate Park, and over in Oakland and East Bay and down south in what became Dade City, what became Daly City. And you'll see there on the left the Army and helping to evacuate civilians during the disaster and afterwards from the waterfront that was saved by the Navy. The human toll was large. The relief efforts were massive. The American Red Cross was sent in by President Roosevelt, and they, together with the Citizens Relief Committee, helped raise millions of dollars and helped quite a few businesses get back on their feet and help the rebuilding effort. Which brings me to the next slide. There is a good ending to this story, and that is the rebuilding of the city. It is, while it's just as shocking to see how quickly the city was so almost completely destroyed, it's amazing how quickly the city rebuilt. People invested from all over the world and the Eastern U.S. New businesses came in. The businesses that were there were able, many of them, to restart and rebuild. Many of the banks restarted. Part of this was due to the Mint being saved by the heroism of its staff and its superintendent, so that there was a financial capital center in the city to help with the rebuilding. You'll see pictures there of the rebuilding, and that photo on the right is a picture of the city 1 year to the day after. That was April 18th, 1907. That's how much had already been rebuilt. Within 2 years, the city was almost entirely rebuilt, and by the 1915 World's Fair, the Panama Pacific Exposition, it was their coming out party for the city's resurgence. So very quickly, the city of San Francisco got back on its feet, but never again was it the largest city in the American West. It was passed by Los Angeles after this. And many people said it never returned to its former glory. I say it did, but the rebuilding is a phenomenal achievement. And the next slide, you'll see how much the city appreciates its own history. The very first year after the disaster, the South of Market boys, the workers that lost all their homes, came back to the surviving fountain, which sat across from the old Palace Hotel and still sits there today. That fountain survived. It was put there in 1875. It's still there on Market Street. You can visit it today. The 1 year anniversary, the South Market boys came and met there at Lotta's Fountain to commemorate the survival of the city and the rebuilding. Every year since then, the city comes together at Lotta's Fountain to commemorate it. And now many people will come in period dress. You'll see there the mayor and many of the city leaders dressing in 1906 attire. At 5:12 a.m. every April 18th, they are there. And it is a great event. I've attended 3 of them. That's a photograph from last year's event, not this year's. And on the right, that's the gilding of the Mission hydrant, the little giant that saved the Mission District there. After Lotta's fountain ceremony, everyone goes over to the Mission, down to the Mission District, and they can spray paint gold the hydrant that saved the neighborhood there. And that is still gilded. I've attended those. I've been able to spray the hydrant myself and help gild it. And it happens every year. So the city very much appreciates its history. And by looking at those events, they know, as the mayor said in one of those, that while we will still face earthquakes and we will still face many other challenges, 1906 will never happen again. There's too many emergency service professionals who have spent decades preparing the city, and the city has done a good job in preparing to make it safe, so that never happens again.
That was fascinating. That was really fascinating. I'm glad it won't happen again. It was absolutely horrifying. I wanted to talk, I have a number of great questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask, before we start in with those, tell us about San Francisco at the time. You mentioned German immigrants, Italian, Irish, of course, the Chinese immigrants as well. 3/4 of the city's people were immigrants. Is
That's
that
right. Three-quarters of the city were either immigrants or children of immigrants, and it spoke many different languages and accents. It was a very diverse city, but the most discriminated against demographic were the Chinese Americans. That's the tragedy of this. Now, I tried to foreground a lot of their history in the book, and it deserves its own presentation. And there are many books written just about that. But it was awful, as that in many American cities, that they were forced into a small section, in that case, 16 square blocks of Chinatown, and they could not reside or work outside Chinatown, couldn't even travel outside Chinatown without their birth certificate or proof of citizenship. So they risked their lives to go back in the fire and retrieve their birth certificates. Also, after the fire, when the city was rebuilding, the white leaders of the city, the men, wanted to push Chinatown out of the city and down the peninsula to a place where they wouldn't have to see them. And the Chinese Americans all gathered together and hired local attorneys and got some property owners on their side and said, we are rebuilding right there in Chinatown where we were. And they made sure that they did. And the story of them rebuilding their neighborhood in the heart of the city where it still is today is a fascinating story.
We definitely got audience questions about the experience of the Chinese residents there. So thank you for that, and we may ask more. In terms of the impact to these immigrants, I mean, it sounds as though for a couple folks, it really gave them a leg up. You described an Italian gentleman, Giannini, a banker. For the and he was managing the Bank of Italy's presence there. And for tell us about what immigrant groups thrived with this. I mean, of course, there were lots of construction workers, but particularly Bankers Row. What was that? Where was that? Who was driving that?
So Medio Giannini, well, first of all, it's the banking center of the West. So all the credit throughout the territory and then state of California was centered in San Francisco. So these banks were essential, and they all burned down. But Emilio Giannini, being Italian American in the Italian, now North Beach is still a very Italian American neighborhood. It's a wonderful place. Emilio Giannini had the Bank of Italy, and he knew from the Italian newspapers that he read about Vesuvius and how bank vaults would overheat and they would have to be cooled before they were opened. And so he had a horse team send it down the peninsula, the bank vaults for his Bank of Italy, and he was the only bank to save his cash reserves. And after the fire, he brought it back up the peninsula and opened up at the waterfront and turned really the Bank of Italy by extending credit to all of the residents early on to extend credit to them to rebuild their homes and their businesses. He built it and started branch banking and formed what is now known as Bank of America. That all started with the disaster and Emilio Giannini, an Italian American.
As a family member, how long could your money have been tied up that you couldn't get access to it? There must have been months for some folks that they.
It was months, and that was the difficulty. That's why the saving of the mint was so important, because they started wire transfers after this disaster also, where someone could deposit money in a Federal Reserve and the East Coast, family members could, and they would then send a telegram to the mint that this has been deposited this Federal Reserve, and they would honor that there to give to the family. So it was like a wire transfer of funds because the mint was there. Keep in mind, Fort Knox had not been built. The gold bullion reserve of the nation was split between Philadelphia, a little bit New Orleans, and some in Denver, but most in San Francisco. So saving that mint was essential to the Federal Reserve, but especially the banking system there. And that was the financial center of the city for weeks and months following the disaster.
We have a question from an advanced question. What was the response of the nation to the disaster? And you just mentioned banking, but what was the response? And also you could look at what was the PR around what was going on there. There seemed to be some hiding of really how bad it was and why was that? So outside of San Francisco, what were people hearing, thinking, saying, doing?
This, because of newspapers and telegrams and even wireless technology, this disaster spread faster than any previous. It was the first truly national disaster. People on the East Coast learned about it within a couple hours, even faster than people in the Bay Area. The national response was vast. There was a lot of contributions, a lot of charity. Many people from other cities would send food kitchens up. Many people gave money to the relief fund. It was advertised in local papers, and businesses would compete to say who could give the most to the people of San Francisco. This was before, I mean, keep in mind, this is what, 70 years before FEMA. So there was no the federal response was to send the army with rations and supplies and tents, which helped a lot. But the national response was very charitable, and they raised a lot of money that then was well managed by a former mayor there in San Francisco to then disperse to the refugees and the unhoused to help them rebuild.
Circling back to immigrants and everybody living there, you say people left. I mean, it seems as though many people stayed. But the people who left, who were they and where did they go? Can one generalize about that?
Um, it's interesting. A lot of them went to East Bay to start businesses or to live. Many people who kept their businesses in the city could not afford to live in the city after this. The cost of housing rose so much because safety standards were increased. So what happens? Rent increases. You don't have all of these affordable tenements that, yes, were unsafe, but were very affordable. So many people then that wanted to keep working in the city had to live East Bay. It's still the story today that, the cost of living goes up so high. So that a lot of people still worked or maintained their businesses in the city, but had to live outside because of the housing difficulties and the reshaping of the city. An interesting vignette is that many people were able to get what were called earthquake shacks. These were these tiny houses that the relief committee built, and you could pay a couple dollars a month for rent. And if you kept current on your rent for, I think it was a year or year and a half, then you could own them, and you could then go purchase a lot. And I talk about in the book that you could purchase small lots to put your earthquake shack on afterwards. The problem is those lots in the city were very expensive. But there was a man down the peninsula named Daly, who he had a farm, and he allowed a lot of refugees to live on his farm. And he also allowed a lot of them to bring their earthquake shacks down there and purchase sections of his property to put them on. And that developed or helped develop what is now Daly City.
Amazing. An advanced question we got. What was it like for you as an author researching such a tragedy?
I enjoy the research much more than the writing. I really don't like the writing. The writing, especially the editing and dealing with editors. But anyway, the research is the joy in it, because you're going through telegrams and letters and diaries and photographs that some of which haven't been seen for 118 years. Some of these had not been accessed. Some of these things at the library, the family would give them to the library in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. San Francisco Public Library maintains all these. And I go through them and I see that no one's checked this out before, or 3 people have, and the last time was 1985. And I say, I'm seeing things here that I'm going to use on the book that have just not been tapped. That's why I wanted to get well beyond published sources and secondary sources and get right into the primary source materials. One of the links I put up was a link for the digital collection, the 1906 Earthquake and Fire Digital Collection. Back in 2006, for the centenary, a bunch of institutions from the San Francisco Public Library, Bancroft Library over at Cal, California Historical Society, Stanford, they pulled their institutions together and tried to digitize a lot of their records. And they did a really good job of putting them all in one place where you can click, and I put that link up there, and you can go by institution what they've digitized. In some places, you're seeing 1/20th or 1/100th of their archives, but you're seeing a good cross section. I think there's more than 10,000 photographs that have been scanned and put up there, and that it might be more now. And I think there's about 3,000 documents, source documents from those. So that helped me, being an East Coaster, to be able to access some of that. But there's no substitute for going in person and seeing all of it. Like the transcripts at the National Archives, those were things that I, from my day job, knew would exist. And when I found them, I said, this is a gold mine, because these are present sense impressions given under oath just months after the event by hundreds of eyewitnesses, and no one had ever looked at them before. And it told exactly how fires started, where and when, and how they spread.
The family stories that you share about families, trudging down the stairs with everything they can carry in their arms, and some of them have wagons, some of them don't, some of them have lost a family member on a different floor in a different place. What do they grab? You mentioned birth certificates. I mean, these family stories are amazing. Were those insurance records? Of course, we have a number of family genealogists, family historians on the line. They're curious if you did any genealogical research, and what advice do you have for people in search of families from that time?
Subscribe to Ancestry. It is indispensable. Ancestry and Find a Grave, I was on every day. And you learn, as anyone knows from who was on Ancestry a lot, is just genealogy. I did that a lot for my first book, and I did it for this also, because I tracked down a lot of family members and contacted them, and they gave me some of the pictures I shared today were from family members I found on Ancestry. The grandson of a colonel at the Presidio, for example. In any event, Ancestry was indispensable, because that's the census records, and it shows where people lived when, who lived with them, what their profession was. You can get paperwork from their jobs in some cases, a lot of good photographs. And Find a Grave, once you get into those, then you can access their death records, and then you can cross-reference these, what researchers in the 70s and 80s tried to do in the 90s. Now I could update and cross-reference everything to create a much more complete death list of casualties. That was all very important.
Many folks are asking about, is there a definitive list of the dead, of the 3,000, or do
No,
you piecemeal it?
there's never going to be, because so many were reduced to so many, there was no records of them being in the city. And you in some places you have a boarding house with 300 residents. You have an incomplete list of who was there at that time, and they didn't have, many of them were immigrants, or they were single moms, or they were widows, and when they died, the tragedy here is they were reduced to ash. And when they died, there was no one there to mourn their loss. And so their graves are unmarked and their lives are unremembered. I tried to track down as many of them as I could. And there's ways in the book, you'll see, I was able to track down old articles from, like, the manager of a boarding house who gave a list of the people that were on his registry that he grabbed on the way out. And so then I was able to go through and figure out, put people in different rooms. That was great. But you can't do that with all these hundreds of tenements and apartments and hotels where they're transient workers that we'll never know. And it's very sad.
The hotel stories that you tell are harrowing and horrifying and amazing, and the sort of the haves and the have-nots in terms of who survived. It was just incredible stories in your book. We have a question here. Did the politicians ever face any consequences for their corrupt failure? I don't think many people know the whole controversy over the shoot to kill in the first couple days. People who were looting were just shot. What did the politicians face after that?
Unfortunately, the mayor was indicted for unrelated things. And the political boss who put him there was indicted. The police chief was indicted. There was so much corruption. This was ongoing before the disaster. After the disaster, the courts finally pounced and prosecuted. I tell that story in the book. Also, some of the people who shot and killed people under these shoot to kill orders were prosecuted, but none were convicted. There were no convictions except the political boss was convicted, spent a few years in prison, and then was let out. The mayor was convicted, but then his conviction was overturned. And that was for extortion, basically, bribery. So no one ever faced consequence for all of these deaths and all this destruction. It's a lesson that this was very much a human disaster. It was caused by man's folly.
In terms of the water supply, mostly.
Water supply and building safety standards that they just knew these landlords could get by as slumlords with all these working class people and Chinese Americans in their own tenements, and not put sprinklers in, not ever be forced to retrofit any of them for safety. And they knew it and they didn't care.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Chinese American community rebuilding and how that came to pass?
Yes, I tell the story of Reverend Ing Chu, who ran a newspaper, and through a lot of difficulties and resourcefulness, went to East Bay and restarted the newspaper in time to rally. Because you got to think, back then, there's no internet, there's no cell phones, there's no way, social media, to rally people that have been displaced. And all these, the Chinese Americans were pushed out and pushed out and pushed out, away from the white refugees, out to the edge of Fort Mason, and then out to the edge of the Presidio, out of sight, in different sections, and then over in Oakland and up in down in San Jose. They went everywhere. But this newspaper, Ing Chu, was able to rally them all together with the threats to their neighborhood, and said, we need to come together, and got them all to contribute for a legal fund, to have them to gather for a meeting and rally the community together with his newspaper, and get these white property owners who had a business interest, because they charged high rent, in maintaining their leases with the Chinese Americans. The Chinese Americans said, we will come back and rebuild in our old neighborhood if you help us and back us up. And they did. And it pushed aside the men in city government who was trying to push them down the peninsula. They started rebuilding right away. And they also made it an Americanized version of what is Chinese architecture, on purpose, so they could not be displaced. And that's why you'll see a lot of pagoda tops. If you see Chinatown prior to the disaster, it did not look like it looks today. It was just nondescript buildings and merchants that catered to largely to tourism, but residences. And they used this Americanized faux Chinese style of architecture when they rebuilt, to make sure they would not be displaced again. And so a lot of the older buildings that were built in 1907 or 8 still there. And that's the way they look.
That's a wonderful story. A last question. Can you put this, many folks have asked if you could put this in context with other disasters across America, and I feel as though you did that. But the worst, where do we land in terms of rating how impactful this was?
Well, I think we all think about things we know, and we think about natural disasters. I think many of us think to Katrina and how awful that was. And I can't compare them. You can't compare things in different eras, in different cities, and different types of disasters. Or we think about 9/11, and the death toll is about the same as 9/11, probably. It's estimated about 3,000 people. The physical property destruction is actually greater. Than another American city has not had 28,000 buildings destroyed, nearly 5 square miles. I mean, the actual property destruction in this was as greater than any other disaster in a major American city. I mean, never before since has a major American city been this totally destroyed.
Heart-wrenching. and so eye-opening. Thank you so much, Matt. We're really grateful. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Matt to do a final reading from his book. Matt, so over to you for that.
Uh, sure. This is about the end of the first night when everyone's trying to go to sleep, and they've seen so much destruction, and they're facing the next new day. The fires have been going for about 24 hours, and this ends chapter 11. By the light and heat of thousands of acres of burning buildings, the city's most illuminated night passed into its haziest, smokiest dawn. People still in San Francisco had survived their city's longest day. Few had slept. The noise of explosions, the heat, the wonder how far the flame had now reached, one man explained, were too much for sleep. Beyond the noise and dangers of the night, there was no end to the worry, anxiety, stress, uncertainty, fear, and sorrow. Tens of thousands of heads rested on ash-covered mattresses or dewy patches of grass, their first night in a place and time of no material permanence. Homes, businesses, streets, light posts, doorways, their own desk or bed, whole neighborhoods, the skyline many had known their entire life, gone. The accumulated treasures of a lifetime and the touchstones of daily routine had evaporated in the short space of hours or minutes or seconds. Thousands stayed awake with worry for a missing spouse or child or parent or friend, and many unfortunate souls tried to sleep through tears, their minds flooding with the awful images of a son's broken body or the sound of a wife's last words. Only numbness or exhaustion could allow sleep to conquer the shock of what was seen and heard and felt the day before, or the worry of what more damage had been done through the night, or what morning light might reveal, or how much more the new day could bring. One 4-year-old girl who found some fitful sleep on a bale of hay with her family in a stable noticed her older brother and younger sister slept, but her parents did not. They simply watched for the new day with despair.
What incredible resilience this required. Thank you for reminding us of how they had to step up and out, and it's inspirational and also very sad. You took us on quite a scary trip back in time, such history, thanks to tech producer Maggie Hastings behind the scenes, Frederic Rigolo of GBH Forum Network, and to the audience out there in Zoomland, we thank you. We appreciate your interest in America's history in all its diversity, stories, good and bad. We hope to see you soon again.